Hello, everybody. Welcome to Informasia. The date in Tokyo is 16th June 2025. And we always meet on the third Monday of every month. I'm Patricia Yarrow, the founder of Informasia in 2020. And as usual, solely to blame for everything, I live in Tokyo. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Michael Trull, located in South Gloucestershire, England, and I checked it, it borders Wales and has some beautiful pictures of it. All right, now who is this young scholar? Dr. Michael Trull, James Trull, recently completed his doctoral thesis at Cardiff University in Wales and is now an independent scholar. His PhD thesis from 2024, A New Diplomatic History, is available at a link I'll put in the chat. Alert, it's 325 pages long, and I hear it's a wonderful read. Okay, whilst researching in Western Japanese history from the 19th century onwards, he's now also undertaking research in his local area of South Gloucestershire in the UK and getting people's names up on memorial walls. He last visited Japan back in 2023 when he was attached to Waseda University. I'm sure he'll be back. With that, let's welcome Michael Trull to the Zoom stage. Okay, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can you see everything all okay?
Very nice.
Awesome. Okie dokie. So yes, my name is Dr. Michael Trull, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some of Britain's most unknown diplomats in Japan, probably, the Chargé d'Affaires. So this is partly based off some of my doctoral research, but is also mostly ballooned into more biographical research that I've done recently, and is predominantly in response to sort of questions and queries that I've received when I've talked about this previously. Good news, yes. Originally, this lecture was going to be about representations of Japan in the Victorian press, but that research has proved far more interesting and significant than I anticipated. So it's not quite ready, so I'm going to be talking about the Chargé d'Affaires today instead. Also, forgive my West Country accent. In every case, when I say Sato, I'm referring to Ernest Sato and not a Japanese name. So just heads up. I'll briefly explain what the Chargé d'Affaires were, provide some quick Anglo-Japanese context for mid-late 19th century, just in case, and then finally we'll discuss the diplomats in question. There are two types, but we only care about one, which is the ad interim one. Is effectively a diplomat who acts as chief diplomat while the head diplomat is indisposed for whatever reason. With the exception of Neale, their temporary nature has largely led them to be forgotten, and their significant contributions equally looked over, in my opinion. They were not passive diplomatic actors. They had their own individual agency, and they conducted British diplomacy as they saw fit. It's my wish that this lecture will reveal their importance to Anglo-Japanese diplomacy, a look at their overall lives, and of course their journeys sort of within Japan and after. So, the numbers, there were 22 in total, which is quite a lot when you think about it. They were an eclectic grouping, but they became more aristocratic and sort of what you would expect a British diplomat to look like as time went on. Part of it was because Japan was becoming more important, but it was also because the diplomatic and consular service was becoming more professionalized. Four never arrived. Two were redirected elsewhere at short notice, and two quickly retired. It's heavily implied that they saw they were being sent to Japan and thought, oh God, oh no, I'm going to retire instead. Almost all of them were also first secretaries. The role is basically synonymous. Only three actually weren't first secretaries when they took the job, two of which we'll look at today. Eight of them were also outside a sort of what you would expect the sort of British diplomat to be. Some of them were Scottish, Anglo-Irish, and there was even a Dutch person. I'll be talking about two Scots today and one Anglo-Irish person as well. So the case studies themselves, firstly will be Edward Neale, then Charles Winchester, then Robert Grant, and then Ralph Spencer Paget over the course of the mid to late 19th century. Quick context then, just in case anyone needs it. Japan was open to the world in 1858, with the principal treaty port powers being Britain, France, Russia, America, and the Netherlands. Nagasaki, Hakodate, and Yokohama were the first ports opened, with a smattering of others like Niigata, Kobe, Osaka, and sort of Tokyo-ish on and off were opened later. Tension between Japan and foreign powers was so much that it gave way to severe internal strife in Japan. Um, Eventually, this led to a civil war, the Boshin War, and eventually the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Tokugawa shogunate was fell, and then it was replaced by a government that was interested in Western ideas and technology. The treaty port system itself became more complex as time went on considerably, and was a constant sign of sort of informal imperial and diplomatic humiliation for Japan. It took decades for Japan to unravel, but eventually it did go by the 1890s. By 1902, Japan was on the cusp of reaching quote unquote great power status, surpassing China, intensifying its rivalry with Russia, and solidifying its control over Korea. So, the first one then, Edward Neale. Neale was born in Madras, India in 1812 into a quite a large family. He was one of nine children, most of which sadly would die over the 1820s and 1830s. I think it's the cholera. It's the most likely because I think that's what killed his father, sadly. He avoided this by being sent back to the UK at the age of 13 to continue his education. He lived with family in Chelsea, London. Um, I think it's very possible that this sort of mass death while he was away for the family shaped his future life, in that most of them sort of went to work with the East India Company or the Indian Civil Service, but he decided against that. And I think the sort of uh, the shock to his family altered his view of what he might do with his life. So, what did he do instead? Age 19, he joined the Scottish Fusiliers in 1832, where he fought in Portugal in the so-called Liberal Wars. Um, he was quite brave. I mean, he fought in basically every major battle of the war. He was even there during the highly protracted siege of Porto as well, which he was commended for. Um, as many did in the war in Portugal, many of them transferred over to fight in Spain, um, to fight during the First Carlist War. He joined the Consolidated Royal Irish. And sort of successive promotions. He was a lieutenant by then. He also received a Medal for Bravery from the Queen of Spain, and also got the respect of many of his comrades. So his superior said that he knows more of real warfare and of a soldier's life than most men. He has been with me nearly for 4 years, and he's always justified my confidence. So despite his young age, he was doing quite well for himself. Near the war's end, he was wounded, which is where I suspect he may have met his future boss, Sir Rutherford Alcock. However, they probably also might have met just from being soldiers in the wars in general. When all was said and done, he had reached the rank of lieutenant colonel at the age of only 24, and it would be at this juncture that he began his diplomatic career. Um, so, in part due to his military beginnings, Neale's diplomatic escapades almost always took on a military angle. Um, his time in the consular service took him across the Balkans and the wider Ottoman Empire, with a particularly extended stay in Varna because of the Crimean War. He helped sort of raise regiments there to fight on behalf of Britain and the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. Prior to this, he would marry his wife, Adelaide, in 1846 in Brussels, a daughter of one of his father's colleagues in the Madras civil service. Um, it was quite a real whirlwind marriage, I think. They had a son less than a year later, but it was a happy marriage nonetheless. Um, in fact, many of his siblings would actually go on to marry before they died. sort of sons and daughters of his father's colleagues. All three of his children, Adelaide, Henry, and William, would be born prior to his time in China and Japan. His military experiences no doubt informed his actions across his career thus far, and they would rear their head again during his time in Japan. His entry into diplomatic service came with China in 1860 and subsequently Japan in 1862 as First Secretary and Chargé d'Affaires. Just as a side, his time in China was mainly to do with setting up the legation at Peking, which is now Beijing today. So, Neale's time in charge in Japan was not simple or quiet, much like the experience of many other diplomats during the Bakumatsu period. Japan was still reeling from being open to foreign trade, with many of the samurai class resenting foreigners and the Tokugawa shogunate equally. One event that represents this was the murder of merchant Charles Richardson by Satsu's samurai in 1862. We probably don't have time to go into the nitty-gritty of it today, but if people have questions about it, I can answer them afterwards. Basically, he was murdered by Satsuma samurai, and the foreign community demanded vengeance. Neale was able to calm things down and say, let's not be hasty, um, which was the smart choice, the smart decision. But at the time, this was greatly resented by the foreign community. By the time things made it back to Britain and the UK, Neale was instructed to get reparations from both the shogunate and Satsuma. He was asked to receive £25,000 from Satsuma and £100,000 from the shogunate, which I think for the shogunate was roughly a third of their revenue. So these weren't shy figures at all. Despite Neale's substantial temper and frustration with shogunate delays, the shogunate eventually paid, leaving only Satsuma. Just as an aside as well, the French and the Americans were able to calm Neale down and actually buy time for the shogunate, um, much for to their help, for Neale's temper was quite furious. Satsuma's effective refusal culminated with Britain instructing Neale to take punitive action. In 1863, Kagoshima, Satsuma's capital, was then bombarded. However, things did not go as swiftly or as easily as intended. There were so many sort of mishaps and things went wrong. So, uh, more Royal Navy officers died than were expected. The ordering to attack during a typhoon wasn't exactly smart. The reaction back in Britain was incredibly negative, putting great pressure on Neale's tenure in charge. At the time, Neale took much of the blame for this, rightly or wrongly. So, this was not the end of Neale's problems in Japan, however. He also had to deal with the imperial expulsion order, where the emperor had ordered the shogun to banish all foreigners by mid-1863. One Japanese polity, Choshu, took this literally and began firing on foreign shipping passing through the Shimonoseki Straits. So with this, Neale also had to deal with his chief Alcott back in London, second-guessing his diplomacy to the Foreign Office. So not great, really. How did he cope with all this? He tried to restore faith after Kagoshima, but was only really successful in appeasing the Foreign Office. But at the end of the day, that was all he really needed to appease was the Foreign Office. Parliament, the press, and the British public remained largely unconvinced, however. He was able to restore relations with the shogunate to a happier footing, and vice versa with Satsuma as well, much to everyone's surprise, providing some sort of semblance of normalcy to Anglo-Japanese relations, if there was normalcy to Anglo-Japanese relations at that time. He also managed to cooperate with other powers to quickly discover that the shogunate had no private intention of following through with the imperial expulsion order mentioned before, making this fear effectively moot. The growing Shimonoseki crisis, it was a problem, it was a fear, but Neale showed to the Foreign Office that it wasn't a problem for Britain, especially as no British shipping had been attacked thus far, and he had already barred all British ships from taking that route anyway. So basically said, it's up to the other treaty powers to deal with it. It's not our problem right now. He more than proved Alcott's equal in dispatches, using evidence to prove that he was ensuring Anglo-Japanese relations remained steadfast, expanding British trade potential. Neale was probably helped that Alcock was his own worst enemy when it came to writing diplomatic dispatches. Neale would write about a paragraph and then attach 15 or so, like, here's my evidence, you can accept it or not. Whereas Alcock might write 15 pages of verbose discussion in scrawly handwriting and say, please believe me. All in all, it was not bad for Neale, considering all he had to deal with. Clearly, Neale had a hand in events and was not a simple cover diplomat in any respect. Sadly, Kagoshima ill health would overshadow the rest of his career, however. So, some opinions then. Fortunately, because of sort of Kagoshima, it means we do have a lot said about Neale in the aftermath of his career in Japan. Alcock and Neale reportedly never saw eye to eye, something that, according to Sato, stems from their time fighting in Spain together. I've never been able to find out more than Sato's comment, so make of that what you will. Um, so if we believe that, in that sense, when diplomacy soured, it's not that surprising that their relationship sort of soured as well. Um, Ironically, I think because I think Alcock and Neil were both quite good diplomats. They were just dealt unlucky in difficult assignments, much was the case for everyone assigned to Japan during that period. And they were also perhaps just too alike in some respects as well. Sato's initial opinion of Neil is not great. Trying to interpret what was Neil's clearly furious temper to the Japanese must have been incredibly awkward. But in hindsight, Sato admits that Neil probably did the right things at the right time, given everything, which I think says a lot. Dr. Willis had nothing nice to say, which is not surprising. The foreign community at the time, did not have a stellar opinion of Neil after Richardson's murder. But by the time he had left Japan, that opinion had remarkably changed, much like Sato. So the Japan Herald in 1863 said, none acquainted with recent affairs in Japan will fail to remember the differences of opinion between many members of this community and Neil, or the severe strictness and harsh words then used. Neil, however, has not treasured this up, and maligned and abused in retaliation. He has forgotten what he doubtless considered his personal wrong, then suffered at their hands, and volunteers a statesman, honourable alike to him who makes and to those who receive, which we think the best answer to those who would be in so wholesale and justifiable a manner as we have alluded to, speak of the British residents in Japan. And a year later, when he sort of left Japan and eventually couldn't, you have the Overland China Mail. Colonel Neale was a man of different temperament who thought less of his own personal importance than of the actual interests of his country. Patient, dispassionate, and firm when firmness was called for, he was singularly well fitted for the duties entrusted to him. In our opinion, it is so far to be regretted that he should have left Yokohama so soon, especially as he is succeeded by a minister, Alcock, who is deficient in many of the qualities essential to the office he holds. Neil goes home to receive deserved congratulations of his friends and of the British government. So these were sort of glowing reports of Neil's time in Japan. They probably glaze over his temper a bit too much, but I think they're quite good, really, in sort of sussing out his overall diplomacy in Japan. So some postscript then. As hinted, he couldn't return to Japan in 1864 due to ill health. He was basically ready to go, and a doctor sort of came in at the last minute and told the Foreign Office, we really don't think you should go. About a year later, he was sent to Greece briefly, partly because of experience as a first secretary, but also because of his time in Patras before. He was then sent to Ecuador, promoted as consul general, but it was a post he would hold until his sudden death in 1866. Just an aside, he was the first non-Catholic afforded a Christian burial in Ecuador, which caused a whole furore there, and I can go into that if anyone's interested after, but it was nuts, to put it lightly. So that was Neil. Secondly, we have Winchester, Dr. Charles Alexander Winchester. Winchester was effectively Neil's replacement when he couldn't go, so Winchester would take the reins. He was born in Aberdeen, Scotland in 1820. He studied medicine at Edinburgh University. He focused on dysentery, which eventually led him to being an assistant surgeon in the Royal Navy. He had a younger brother who eventually became a deputy inspector in Bombay, and two much younger sisters. When Winchester joined the Royal Navy, he was aboard the HMS Cornwallis during the First Opium War, and he would be present for the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. It's possible he also met his future boss, Sir Harry Parkes, at that point, but if not, he would have met him a few years later anyway. He eventually sort of left the Royal Navy and was made the island's first colonial surgeon at Hong Kong in 1842. After which, partly because of many deaths due to the climate in China and sort of people having to return home for health, he found himself in the British Consular Service in 1843. Um, he basically bounced around Siam and not Siam, sorry, bounced around China. And then during this time, he befriended Sir Harry Parkes. He married his wife, Jane Blake, and had his only son, Charles Blake Winchester, who was born during the Amoy riots in 1852. His son would go on to also be a magistrate, also in Bombay. Um, Winchester's sort of rise was definitely aided by the death and illness of others. He sort of rapidly took on roles if and when. He clearly said yes, basically, whenever he was offered something. Um, I also have to thank Alex Byrne, as we actually have a picture of Winchester from 1863. I've been hunting a photo of him since 2018, so I'm immensely grateful. Thank you. Um, just an aside as well, before we get into him being posted to Japan, Winchester tried to learn Chinese. He got quite good in terms of learning characters. He sort of memorized over 1400, but he could not cope with speaking. He could not cope with Chinese mannerisms, and so he gave up. So by the time he went to Japan, he had fully given up and had no interest in the language at all. His pathway to Japan was being promoted to Consul of Hakodate, so the middle of nowhere. Thankfully, he was seconded to Nagasaki as acting consul, which he was much happier for. And a year later, he was given the consulship of Yokohama in 1863, the principal consulate and basically probably the best consulate to have. So, how did he become Chargé d'Affaires? Neale, as said, couldn't return because of ill health, and Alcock at this point had been officially reassigned and unofficially fired. Um, so this meant that Winchester had to be made acting First Secretary and Chargé d'Affaires. This wasn't actually his first time as Chargé d'Affaires. He was Chargé d'Affaires before for a few months. That sort of proved that he was capable of doing this again for a more considered period of time. Um, he was well liked by his colleagues in Japan from the beginning, despite Dr. Willis calling him as fat as a pork butcher. They were all sort of liked him. He was easy to get on with. He was sort of comes across as much different to Neale and Alcock. Just an aside as well, Dr. Willis also called Mrs. Winchester a daibutsu, partly because of her size, but also because she had quite the overbearing personality, apparently. Make that of what you will. Um, so challenges then. What did Winchester have to deal with as chargé d'affaires? He had two primary issues to deal with. Firstly, he faced dual pressure from both the shogunate and the Foreign Office to deal with growing foreign trade, most notably in arms. Um, this was basically people like the name like Glover and the rest selling guns to Satsuma, Choshu. Every side imaginable was being sold guns in every possible way. It didn't help that in China you had the Taiping Rebellion, and then of course you had the American Civil War going on. So weapons, ammunition, all the rest of it weren't exactly hard to come by and sell on at a great profit. Secondly, he also had to deal with the aftermath of the Shimonoseki campaign of 1863-64. This is what Neale witnessed the beginning of, and Alcock eventually helped deal with, and that's why he got unofficially fired and officially reassigned. Um, it was agreed that Choshu had to pay an indemnity, which the shogunate would actually pay on their behalf. Again, there is a lot to discuss, so I'll simply say a little bit, and then if people have more questions, please bug me about it later. Um, the best way to describe it is what was initially agreed in the indemnity left Britain the most worse off, despite doing most of the heavy lifting. Um, effectively, the shogunate would have to pay about 3 million Mexican silver dollars on behalf of Choshu, but Britain would receive the smallest amount because of the French inserted a little bit of fine print that everyone went along with. So how did he eventually deal with all of this? Here's quickly from the Japan bunch showing sort of what gun running was doing to Japan in the space of a few years. Um, he dealt with this the best way he could. I mean, he quickly realized that trying to stop gun running was basically impossible. He did not have the manpower or the ships or the knowledge to really cope with it. And also realized that it'd be counterproductive that if he did stop it because it was making it Britain an awful lot of money. And if he did stop it, it would basically allow French, Portuguese, Dutch, Russian, whoever else to make money instead of Britain. So he basically said to the Foreign Office, I will try and deal with it, perhaps. And then he said to the shogunate, it's your problem, not mine. We'll do it. He just basically played for time, really. Um, this proved incredibly successful down the line for his successor, Harry Parkes, sort of leaving him unencumbered when he came in a year later in 1865. Winchester also laid the groundwork for a more acceptable version of the indemnity, with help from the Foreign Office, it must be said, instead of simply setting as well. Despite his effective management and positive diplomacy with all involved, these achievements were largely forgotten or attributed to others. The Foreign Office did not forget, though, and he was sort of quote unquote promoted back into the consular service in a way, as consul of Shanghai in 1865, which technically the same rank as Yokohama was much more prestigious than Yokohama, put it that way. Opinions. So sadly, yes, despite Winchester's success, he's largely forgotten. Besides Dr. Willis's colorful description, there's little about him other than a passing comment from Sato, sort of saying, in hindsight, much of Parks's initial success was down to Winchester's diplomacy. There's also no real postscript for Winchester either, for despite moving on to Shanghai, his wife would sadly pass away in 1867. And he would then quickly retire in 1870 and left Shanghai for London, where he lived quietly until 1883. It's largely implied as well that he retired to sort of collect a pension so he could give it to his son's education, who was taking the bar at this time, which is quite nice, really. Um, so yeah, sadly, despite some sort of brief recognition from Sato, Winchester remains largely forgotten in Anglo-Japanese diplomacy. So the other Scotsman then, Robert Watson. Um, Watson was born in Forres, Scotland in 1834. He attended Forres Academy, which is still going strong today, actually. They were very surprised to receive emails from me. He excelled at classics, history, geography, and languages. But despite this early academic proficiency, he joined the East India Company as a cadet aged 16 and went on to serve in India. He came home quickly, though, in 1855 due to the death of his father. But he was quickly petitioning to be sent back, and he was given the mission to sort of trek to Persia on his own, all the way from Constantinople, Syria, Iraq, all the way to Persia on his own, which he did so, but he did it as well to collect information of the Royal Geographical Society. He did quite well. They were very impressed, and he was sort of made an attaché in the British legation in Persia on his return. This was sadly cut short because of the India uprisings in 1857. He would see military action in sort of Maratha India under Sir James Outram. But his successful sort of brief time in Persia wasn't forgotten, and he returned as an attaché in 1859. He was promoted eventually as a second secretary, um, and he was also later then attached to the Bombay Staff Corps as well. This promotion as second secretary was a bit odd. not to say that Watson didn't deserve it, but I later found out that this was actually a sort of event that happened to all attachés in 1862, I believe. Um, it was a long-going issue that attachés were unregulated and unpaid in the diplomatic and consular service. So, as a compromise, it was decided that they would all be promoted into second secretaries all at once, which sort of just so happened to coincide with Watson's time in Persia and helped sort of kickstart his career. In 1865, he formally resigned from his military career, um, and then joined the famous St. James's Club, which is full of diplomats. And this would be where he wrote his famous History of Persia. He would serve all over the Middle East. He would eventually go to South America, which he fell in love with. He would go to Greece. Um, and he would also finally end up in Japan in 1872. Greece was when he was made first secretary in charge of affairs. And also, just as an aside, that's when he sort of became sort of more widely known beyond the diplomatic service. He'd already sort of become a little bit famous from his History in Persia book, which was well regarded. But when he was in Greece, he edited Murray's guidebook to Greece, and he also helped raise money for the destitute maid of Athens, Theresa Macri, the girl who inspired the famous poem by Lord Byron of the same name, which brought him some minor public recognition at the time. But after Greece, he would be sent to Japan from 1872 to 1873. Um, of the four discussed today, Watson probably had the most to deal with during his time in charge, just because it coincided with events outside of his control. He was Austria-Hungary's representative during his time, adding to his workload. He, with others, had to deal with Japan's anti-Christian laws, which, after some of the worst persecutions in Christian persecution in Japanese history in the later 1860s, now referred to as the Fourth Persecution. Additionally, the treaty port system had become much more complex, going from five powers to now 16. And finally, the Italians had broken ranks in an attempt to gain preferential access to Japan's interior for trade in exchange for removing Italy's treaty port privileges. This was mainly for silk, which in Europe had been devastated by a disease at the time. Japan was also still, in a mild way, reeling from the Boshin War. So a brief example that I discovered not too long ago was he wanted to do a tour of Niigata to sort of see what the problems with the port were and how we could boost it as a treaty port. And the Japanese basically politely said, uh, you can't go because we're not entirely in control of the provinces around there because there's uprisings, rice riots, etc. This was not the most significant headache he had to deal with. The most significant was the Maria Luz incident. The Maria Liz incident is a lot to go into, so again, I will just sort of explain the minimum. If people have more questions, I'll talk about it later. A Peruvian ship heading from Macau carried hundreds of Chinese coolies aboard. It was forced to dock at Yokohama after being damaged in a storm. Some coolies escaped and managed to make it to the HMS Iron Duke, where they talked of the terrible conditions and how they were being horribly treated. They were quickly handed over to the Japanese, who then handed it back over to the captain, and the Japanese basically said, treat them better, but nothing more was said. A day or two passed, and another coolie escaped, again making it to the British, who said that the previous escapees were terribly tortured for what they did. Um, I tried to gauge Watson's reasoning for getting involved. It's kind of hard to sort of nail down. But his reasoning to the Foreign Office was that because they escaped and made it to a British ship and they then handed the coolies back, it was Britain, we were included in the torture. We were sort of, guilt by association. So he gathered up some Royal Marines and stormed the Maria Luz. He freed hundreds of indentured laborers and gave the legal and diplomatic situation to Japan to sort out. Um, this was fine, but it angered virtually every treaty port power there. Um, because it basically, one, it violated extraterritoriality, and two, they handed the situation over to the Japanese. Um, it was a big gamble, but it did eventually pay off in the end. Um, because not only was it the correct moral decision, it was the correct diplomatic decision. The Foreign Office was happy in the end. Japan was happy at showing some sort of uh, early mild diplomatic independence. Relations with China were improved because, of course, Chinese coolies were involved and they were freed. And America had backed Britain privately and sort of improved relations there as well, which is sorely needed after the American Civil War. Even if it did anger almost every other nation, and even if there was some sense of British self-interest on Watson's part for being involved, I can get into that later if anyone wants to ask. But it proved the right choice in the end. In regards to the other challenges that he faced, he was successful in regards to working with colleagues, working off of what Parks had done previously and what Parks would actually continue and keeping pressure on Japan to liberalize their religious laws. This happened in 1873. He also successfully hijacked Italo-Japanese discussions and brought France and America into it as well to ensure the treaty port system was not harmed and that any advantages gained by one were gained by all. Despite all this and his additional work, Anglo-Japanese relations and Britain's wide diplomatic position in East Asia were largely improved. After Greece and Japan, Watson has cemented himself effectively as the number two diplomat for the Foreign Office. So he did quite well for himself. Opinions, again, sort of like Winchester, there's not a lot to go on. There was a slight disagreement with Parks over the location of a new permanent legation in Tokyo, but nothing minor, and Parks would never say anything in official stuff anyway. However, if you sort of look a bit deeper, I went through Sato's letters, and you can sort of find some gobbets of information to sort of reveal what they thought of him. And it sounds like there's sort of small ads of genuine warmth and collegiality for Watson even long after he left Japan. I suspect a lot of it was because, l- like Sato, like Aston, Watson himself was quite academically inclined, and I think they got on in that sense. Um, so I think it helped sort of uh, be shown a bit more collegiality in the grand scheme of things compared to maybe people like Parks, who could be quite distant with his underlings. Um, his career was quite extensive after Japan, unlike Winchester and Neale. Japan was sort of a middle point in the road, as it were. He went on to serve in Denmark, America, Portugal, and Sweden. In fact, it would be in when he was serving in Sweden that he would marry his wife, who's slightly blurry and unflattering picture. Um, and he had two children not long after, Elfrida and Herbert. Herbert would also go on to be quite the prolific diplomat. And then after Sweden, he would be unemployed for a year. He sort of couldn't find anywhere the Foreign Office wanted to send him, so he decided to finally retire. This didn't halt his academic endeavors, nor his travel. He continued to write. He nearly went to Paraguay again to sort of represent some investors who held Paraguay in debt, but it was cancelled at the last minute, much to his chagrin. He also kept in touch with colleagues. He continues to write to newspapers a lot. And he also providing sort of diplomatic commentary and historical corrections wherever he could. Of particular interest were his comments in support of ending the unequal treaties with Japan, which he continued to write about until his death in 1892. Before his death, he was visited by Sato two or three times, who shows genuine concern and warmth for his former chief after he witnessed his declining health. So Watson, he slowly started to become blind and sort of bedridden. So Sato visited him a few times because Watson was like, "Please, can you help me finish a book of mine on South America?" And Sato helped very kindly. Asked around if there was anyone who would help him possibly update his book while he had ill health. Um, as I said, I like Watson. I think he did well for himself. I think his career in Japan sort of helped propel him forward, and also that his academic inclinations helped sort of gel him with his colleagues in Japan. So lastly, then, we have Ralph Spencer Paget, um, from a very, very prestigious aristocratic family. When he was born in Copenhagen in 1864, he had a great uncle who commanded the cavalry at Waterloo. Another uncle who was High Lord of the Admiralty and politician during the 1860s, who was also actually involved in Kagoshima, awkwardly. A grandfather who was a diplomat, and another father who was a diplomat. His mother was very close friends with Queen Victoria. Um, she was a lady in waiting of his, and as a result, he would often go on holiday to places like Italy with the then Prince of Wales, and they became close friends. He had an older brother and sister by a few years, Victor and Alberta, named after Victoria and Albert. Um, the current and most senior Paget, for example, carried the Standard of Wales at Charles III's coronation in 2023. So they are still alive and kicking. So, of course, Paget unsurprisingly went to Eton. He was there for 5 years and he excelled at languages. He continued his studies abroad, traveling, and by 1888, he was definitely fluent in German, Turkish, and Arabic. At the sprite age of 24, he was placed in Vienna under the close, watchful eye of his father in 1888, who was the ambassador to Austria at the time. From there, he was briefly seconded to America, which I don't think he enjoyed. And then he was sent to Japan as Chargé d'Affaires, but only as third secretary. This was fine until Hugh Fraser suddenly died in post. John Harrington Govans, who was the Japanese secretary, was back in London doing a treaty revision, and the actual first secretary, who was Gerard Lothar, wasn't quite there at the time, but was also not really well thought of by many. Um, but don't quote me on that. So Ralph Paget sort of had to take the reins for a few months while things uh, sort of gelled over. This would have been fine if it weren't for the fact that he had not very much help from the Foreign Office because of domestic political turmoil and the fact that Japan and China were barreling towards conflict. Um, to sort of briefly introduce you to it, nationalism in China and Japan are sort of reaching fever pitch over Korea, and the rivalry was reaching fever pitch. So by the time Paget took charge, things were already in motion. And the problem with the Foreign Office was the Liberal government of the day was a minority government. It was only held by Irish nationalist votes. And then you can see the photographs of the Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harcourt. They hated each other, absolutely hated each other. They would not agree on anything. It was so, I mean, to give you sort of an example, it was so bad that when there was some Armenian massacres in the Ottoman Empire, the Liberals couldn't decide what their official position was until after they had been booted from office. That was how sort of helpful they were when they were tearing each other apart in government. So Paget had to deal with all of this while he was in charge. Um, Paget was diligent despite everything. He worked with colleagues in China, namely Sir Nicholas O'Connor, to try and avoid war. But he quickly realized that this was sort of a moot effort, that this would not go well, that Japan and to a lesser extent China as well were sort of wedded to we're not going to change our position, and if it comes to war, it comes to war. He sort of then preemptively started to get guarantees from everyone involved to sort of protect British interests, to make sure Hong Kong and Shanghai would be, would avoid conflict, etc., etc. This greatly impressed the Foreign Office because of the time delay. They were actually going to tell him this. They were going to say, "Yep, you're right. It looks like Japan's not going to avert course." But the fact that he was already doing this greatly impressed the Foreign Office. Um, Paget was also quick to ascertain sort of public opinion in Japan quite well. He sort of realized that public opinion had become so virulent that if the Japanese government was to sort of back down or change course, it would mean the end of that government of the day. So he was really good at sort of judging what was happening on the ground and saw that it was effectively an impossible situation. Both Connor and Paget worked tirelessly to try and get both sides to alter their positions. but they soon changed to safeguard British interests instead. Um, Opinions. To say he did well, given the circumstances, is a bit of an understatement, in my opinion, given that he was so young and inexperienced. Um, for me, he was more than a simple cover diplomat, just like the others, and was not passive to events. He sort of actively saw to the needs of British diplomacy. And I think he came out of this short stint in charge only for a few months, quite the impressive sort of young diplomat. And this moment would prove to be a rapid turning point in his career. Um, Also, as well, sort of a lot of his colleagues were greatly impressed. People like Sato and the rest, when they came back, thought sort of he did a job well done. So as a reward, he was promoted to second secretary, but with the private caveat that as long as he was in Japan, he was effectively a first secretary in all but name. Um, which, of course, unfortunately for Paget, came with all the work. What came with the promotion was all the work that came with it. Um, Paget must have been aware of his sort of new, sort of minor diplomat celebrity status, if you call it that, with glowing statements from Japanese and sort of foreign community newspapers and sort of pats on the back from the Foreign Office. Um, However, sort of Paget's time in Japan as it went on, he struggled. Like many diplomats before him, he hated the heat. According to Sato, in almost every conversation, he complained about the heat and asked whether he would be when he was going to be sent somewhere else. Um, he also sort of commented about the lack of civilization in Japan. This comment would eventually come to bite him, for he'd be sent to other places uh, because of his grievances that would equally annoy him. He also hated the fact that he had, despite all the responsibilities of a first secretary, he wasn't that rank, which of course annoyed him that he wasn't able to go to places like Nikko and sort of enjoy himself a bit more like some of his colleagues. He knew he could get better and he wanted it, and he sort of badgered profusely that, I want to go somewhere else and move on to better things. Um, and I think the legation quickly realized they wouldn't be able to hold on to him or stop him for long. So his opportunity soon came. He was sent back to Cairo for a year, then Munich, then Constantinople. And then he was sent to Guatemala, Nicaragua, in 1901 as first secretary in charge of affairs, the promotion he always wanted. Unfortunately for him, he hated it. He hated everything about the country. The weather was even hotter than Japan. And the most annoying thing was that in every village and town he entered, as was diplomatic protocol, a brass band was there to play God Save the King, and it reportedly he would write letters to the Foreign Office that he was going insane listening to God Save the King everywhere and every time, and begged to be sent somewhere else. Unfortunately, his sort of begging that he would accept any other posting as long as it wasn't Nicaragua got him sent to Siam. Um, This is unfortunate because the Foreign Office was having difficult getting anyone to go there because of the climate, and then they sent they sent poor Paget there anyway. Ironically, though, he would say that these were the best years of his life in hindsight. He loved the country. He married his wife back in the UK but she would go out with him when he was still there. And when he left, he would write a glowing letter of friendship to the King of Siam for what he did. Um, his wife, who you can see there on the right, he married her in 1907 in a very lavish private ceremony. Apparently, her bridal veil alone cost $2,500, so it's all right for some. His time in Siam was mostly coping with sort of French rivalry and German rival, mainly German rivalry, and renegotiating with the Thai over a treaty. It would be this sort of German rivalry that would, because he was in line for to be ambassador of Berlin, but the sort of anti-Germanness put him off, put the Foreign Office off, I should say, and he was sort of made resident minister to Munich and Stuttgart instead. He was only there for a short time and was then sent as minister to Serbia, which went quite well. Him and his wife are still sort of historically famous there to this day. He didn't get on with the foreign secretary, reportedly. I can't find anything that sort of backs this up, but sort of it's a thing that many other historians have repeated, so I shall repeat it too. He didn't get on with the foreign secretary of the time, so he couldn't get a job. So he was sort of made undersecretary to foreign affairs eventually, and sort of like do this and shut up. And then during the war, he was sent back to Serbia to be the British Commissioner for Relief Work. And this is how his wife became, if not more famous than he did, because she joined the British Red Cross and became a nurse and donated massive amounts of money to the people of Serbia during the First World War. He then became minister to Denmark in 1916. Again, he hated the climate. He said it was too cold and begged to be somewhere else. He was eventually sworn to the Privy Council. So he was sort of now with his best friend, King Edward VII. And then he was promoted to be the first ambassador to Brazil for his time in Denmark. I assume that the weather there was also too hot because he was only there for a year before he retired into obscurity for the next 20 years. Just an aside for his wife as well, his wife survived him, and during the Second World War, she actually sold their estate and almost everything they owned to donate to Serbia again during the Second World War. So she was quite the philanthropic person. Um, some conclusions then overall. From Neale to Paget, the Chargé d'Affaires are more than quite simple cover diplomats while their chief diplomats were away or absent. I think it's clear they wielded power like any other head diplomat and made important decisions that future foreign policy had to consider and adapt to. They were active diplomatic actors who influenced Anglo-Japanese diplomacy to a significant extent across the period. And consequently, their own prior experiences influenced their diplomatic actions and agency like any other diplomat. Often, their struggles and achievements in Japan springboarded them in all into largely successful and beneficial diplomatic careers. Japan was a learning experience that greatly influenced their standing and future endeavors. Whilst their temporary nature may have relegated their perceived importance in prior scholarship, they are clearly deserving of far greater study and research. Clearly, British diplomacy overall was not as private or controlled as some might suggest, particularly in far-flung parts of the world where chargé d'affaires were a much more normal sight. Thank you for listening. Phew.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, could everybody please unmute yourselves? That was just wonderful. And it's towards the end, as Ian Ruxton said, good to have photos of these forgotten men whose letters I have read many times. Okay, we have about 8 questions here and some pretty good chat. But here's the questions. Towards the early part, Robert Morton asks, was Japan humiliated in its links with the West? Alcock thought they had the upper hand in their dealings with it.
Officially, yeah, I think because the shogunate followed this sort of policy of shoving everyone to the periphery, which I think until sort of 1865 did work quite well. The problem was the perception for sort of many, I guess, underneath was that the country is being torn apart and the shogunate is the root of all problems, I guess. But no, I would agree that in the first off, the shogunate sort of delay and defer, or so and so is ill, so we can't meet you today, or I'm sorry, we have to translate this into Dutch first and then Japanese, all the rest of it. I think they did do quite well.
And also, I think the insecurity of Japan
Yes.
undermined and the fact they did the government did not much about it, undermined the diplomats.
Yes.
Okay. From Lance Gatley, was Japan humiliated in its links with the West? Does that make
No,
sense?
I was trying to answer. I was trying to answer the question. The humiliation comes from the unequal treaties. That's what the Japanese almost exclusively refer to when they speak of being mistreated by the foreign powers. It's the unequal treaties, and the unequal treaties are the reasons that you have that you don't have ambassadors in the embassies. UK, United Kingdom, and Japan did not um, establish normal diplomatic relations until 1899. They established regular diplomatic relations with China, Qing Dynasty, in 1877. So the head of the mission, the normal head of the mission in Peking, or the Beijing at Peking at the time, or no, actually wherever it was at the time, was in fact an ambassador, and I don't believe the UK ever had an ambassador in Japan until 1899, when the ambassador is accredited to the head of state, to the emperor. That's when he's presented to the emperor. Anyone less, a minister or a chargé, is simply ad interim. The correct diplomatic title is typically chargé d'affaires, and I don't speak French, but it's ad interim, right?
UK ambassadors were exchanged in 1905, UK and Japan ambassadors.
The first ambassadors were exchanged in 1905.
Right.
It's called exchange, but it's a unilateral action where the UK says we now have an equal treaty. The treaty was not equal, so they could not exchange ambassadors. They exchanged ambassadors, but it essentially meant UK sent their ambassador, Japan sent their ambassador. But what did that mean? That the treaty that came into effect, it was established in 1893 or so. It came into full effect in 1899, and they didn't get around to sending an ambassador till later. So the exchange is actually not really an exchange of such. It says that we now have a treaty and we can send our ambassador, who is accredited to, from the head of our state to the head of your state. The chargé was accredited to the foreign minister.
But the minister, they were the minister plenipotentiary and all of that. They were accredited to the head of state.
Yes.
So
Ministers can be, yes. Ministers can be accredited to the head of state. This is all governed by the Vienna Conventions.
Okay. One thing I realized about the extraterritoriality. So I mean, the interesting thing was the Chinese were not bothered about extraterritoriality, and it continued, I think, until 1942 or something like that.
Yeah.
But the thing is, extraterritoriality is still alive and well. If an American citizen commits a crime in Afghanistan, he's certainly not going to, or he or she is not going to be tried by a local court.
I think you're a couple of months late on that one.
Or in Okinawa, for that matter.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
if
neither one of those is true. Neither of those statements is true.
What?
Neither of those statements is true. It's not true. If you're an American citizen, you commit a crime in Okinawa, and the Japanese police get you, good luck.
Yeah, but there is the status of forces agreement, is there not?
If you're military, then I don't think you'll be tried in a Japanese court.
Yeah.
That's not true either.
Well, what is the status of forces agreement?
It's much more complicated than that.
All right. But the thing is that the concept is still alive and well.
That's not, no, it's not extraterritoriality. That's a top-down, unequal treaty. That's what the Japanese are talking about. And your question regarding why were they upset? And you mentioned someone who thought that the Japanese had out-negotiated them. Well, that's a different matter. They agreed to an unequal treaty, and the UK, I believe, was the first nation to establish an equal treaty with Japan. Everybody else took much longer to get rid of them because they had preferential treatment. But that's why you write in most favored nation status in those sort of documents. Because if one folds, then everybody folds. And Japan focused on England in order to get England to agree to an equal treaty, then everybody else would eventually have to ripple. It would be a ripple effect. So they focused on England in order to get them to do it. But the chargé is simply the person in charge of the mission. And I was a diplomat. I was a consular officer. I was a diplomat. I did all this stuff. And I actually read the things, which nobody ever did. And the treaties are old and complex, and they've tried to rationalize them. But in order to understand all of these gyrations after the Meiji Restoration, you got to understand all these treaties and what the Japanese wanted to do. They hated them. It almost brought down the government every time they talked about it.
Okay.
I think I should shut up and let Michael respond to that because Michael is our speaker.
All
I
right.
mean, I would say that really the unequal treaties of humiliation, it was there during the shogunate, but it didn't really take off until after the Meiji Restoration. That's when it became a real stickler for everything. Because I think when they did the Iwakura mission, that's when they sort of realized that as long as this was going, they were never going to be treated uh, as equals, and they tried their best to sort of hurry the end of it, but they didn't get anywhere until the 1890s anyway.
Okay,
Uh,
so the
and
so the high Michael, in your list of the senior most diplomat from the English embassy to Japan, does it ever get above minister level until what did who was it?
1905.
It was Claude MacDonald, yeah.
No, what was the rank? What was the diplomatic rank?
Oh, Minister Plenipotentiary.
Okay, so the minister is a level below the ambassador.
Yes.
That's the point. They didn't have an equal footing, so they couldn't exchange ambassadors.
But the thing is that in the, around Parks's time, Britain didn't have an ambassador in America. I mean, America wasn't considered deserving of an ambassador. The only places, there were four countries that had an ambassador. I think it was France,
Austria, Austria,
yeah,
France,
Austria,
Russia.
Russia, and was it Turkey? Was Constantine?
I think it might have been Turkey, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were very, very
So
few
what?
ambassadors.
That's not pertinent.
No, I think the problem is you're applying a modern asterisk onto what Britain considered at the time. For Britain, the rank also designated importance. So, for example, in Japan, they only had a minister because Alcott complained that he should have that rank and not be a simple consul general. Um,
Listen to what you just said. He pushed to have the higher rank of minister. Why didn't he push to be an ambassador? Because he
because
wouldn't
Japan
get
wasn't
ambassador.
important enough to have an ambassador.
It's based on the treaty. Go look it up. The Vienna Conventions. Now the very old Vienna, it was the oldest extant treaty in the world when I was a consular officer. It dated back to 1798 or something. This is why consular children born overseas actually get citizenship in most countries, but diplomatic officers don't. And what they've done since then is say that's kind of silly. Let's rationalize those between the consular and the diplomatic aspects of the Vienna Conventions, of which there are multiple. And the latest one is like 1962 or so. But I think that, who was it, Tim? I'm sorry, Tim Chamberlain mentioned it, 1909, or Michael, 1909, they exchanged ambassadors. Why? The treaty went into effect in 1899. Then they could exchange ambassadors. They could have an ambassador. Until then, they wouldn't have an ambassador because the treaty of the diplomatic treaty between the countries didn't support that level of engagement. I'll bet you, Michael Trull, I'll bet you a good shepherd's pot pie or whatever the hell you eat in Wales. Check it out.
No, it's not that I don't agree with the fact that they couldn't have an ambassador until the treaty was reneged. I just think even without the treaty, they never would have promoted Japan. They never would have had ambassador until much later anyway.
Two different questions. That's
Okay.
and that's why it's not a big deal that they had a series of charges. Now, I think what you're talking about is the consular officers are typically seen as lower level bureaucrats within the foreign services, within the ministries, the consular officers, because back in those days there were two different treaties that governed their rights and their activities.
Yes, but chargé d'affaires are diplomatic most of the time.
Correct, which means that they moved from the jurisdiction of a consular treaty to the diplomatic treaties.
Okay.
This is very obscure stuff, but if you run into the wrong diplomat in a public forum, they're going to call you on this, I think.
I mean, I've given this talk to diplomats before and nobody said anything.
That's because most of them are idiots. They don't know their own history. Like I said, I actually read the things when I became a consular officer, and I kept asking people about it. And everybody said, "Why do you care?" Nobody ever read. Nobody ever read the The treaties are very strange. They're very old. It's very, but it has an effect, and that's what I think that's what you're talking about from an administrative standpoint. Is somebody saying, "I want to be a minister. I don't want to be just this level." Why would you do that? You would do that, and it goes exactly to your new diplomatic history thesis that these people had agency. They're going, look. I'm talking to the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and I'm talking to a consular officer. I want to talk to the Minister of Foreign Affairs personally. I want him to know that I'm the representative of my country to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. If you walk into the chargé, it's the same thing. Chargé just means a person head of the mission while the ambassador or the senior officer, whoever it is, it's ambassador, minister, envoy down to chargé. I could be the chargé for a day if everybody else in the building is out. They would send a notice to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and say, "You're the chargé to affairs." Doesn't matter what my primary job is inside the embassy. I'm just in charge for the day, right?
Yeah.
And you need to notify the host country that that's happened, right? So what they're saying is, this is exactly proving your thesis. These people had agency. They say, "Look, I need more face. I need more relative power vis-a-vis the Japanese so I can do what I need to do." Not just, and somebody in England, maybe you're right. They said, "Well, Japan's not very important. We don't need a minister in Tokyo." And these guys push back and says, "Yes, you do. I'm the guy. I need to do this."
Okay. Anything to add, or should we leave it there?
No, I think that was
Can I
very
just
succinct, to be fair.
add one thing? Can I just add one thing that there was the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, which rather made it important that ambassadors be exchanged, subsequently, and well, quite soon after that.
Yes.
That's a good question. Do you have military alliances between?
It's not a question, it's a statement.
No. It raises a good question for me. Can you have a military alliance between unequal powers? I think the answer is not really. So, like in the United States during the occupation, the United States occupied Okinawa. There was no mutual security treaty until the United States left Okinawa, right? And then the mutual security treaty comes along and takes that into account. And you still have, a big presence there, but it's a different issue. But I think Ian raises an interesting question from a diplomatic history standpoint.
But sorry, I don't want to carry it on, but it is interesting that they would wait 3 years from the Anglo-Japanese alliance before they actually exchanged ambassadors.
Have you ever been to Whitehall?
Yeah.
Have you ever dealt with a British bureaucrat?
No. Fair enough.
Okay.
But
Okay.
Maybe they wanted to wait until the end of the Russo-Japanese War before.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
I don't think the Japanese cared about whether they were called an ambassador or a minister. That wasn't one of their big things, I don't think.
Well, it's not a primary driver of why they wanted to get rid of the unequal treaties and make equal treaties. It was primarily the extraterritoriality is what drove all of them crazy.
That's right.
That drove them crazy.
Yeah.
But surely if you have an ambassador, you have more claim to be a great power, which was what Japan was trying to say it was after the Russo-Japanese War.
Well, correct. Yeah. It's like Korea. Japan had the same diplomatic status vis-a-vis these powers as Korea. And Korea was a 5% literacy puppet state. I mean, there was nothing there.
And also, of course, Japan insisted on extraterritoriality in Korea for its citizens.
Yes. And
Okay.
China.
All right. Should we venture to the remaining questions?
Let's go.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. That was really interesting. All right, I'm taking charge. David Burley asks, what does deference of major decisions mean? Is it deferral?
Yes, probably.
So yes, probably deferral.
Yeah, deferral. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
major decisions. Okay, thank you. Charles DeWolf asks, to what extent was the indemnity a matter of financial interest, and to what extent a matter of asserting power and inflicting humiliation?
For Britain, it was basically a wager of we don't really care about the money, but we can use it to force Japan to do more things they don't want to do. Um, for the French and the Dutch, it was a bit more about the money, particularly as a lot of French and Dutch shipping had been attacked when the Shimonoseki crisis was ongoing. That's also partly why they got more money than Britain. The Americans, the Dutch, and the French all got an extra $140,000 that the French had slipped in this sort of minor treaty note, and the Americans and Dutch just copied it over, and Britain just went, "Oh, what's this?" Out of shock. So yeah, for Britain, it was more about how can we use this to sort of maybe open an early treaty port or two, or force the Japanese to sort of accede to tariff renegotiations, that sort of thing. The only ones who truly didn't care were the Americans. The Americans were like, let's leave it up to the Japanese to decide whether they pay it or not, or whether they swap it for early treaty tariff revision or opening a treaty port, etc., etc. There's a really good story of how the money was spent by the Americans. It took a long time for the indemnity because it was such an extortionate amount of money, 3 million. Um, I think they did reduce it to two. But it basically, eventually, sometime in the 1870s, the Americans eventually got the money, but the US Senate voted to give it back as like to sort of benefit relations. And I think Japan in kind sent back some cherry blossom trees, as they often do. I think the money was used to build some of the defenses in Yokohama. I don't probably not there anymore, but it was like sea defenses and stuff. But yeah, it was basically for Britain. Not we don't really care about the money too much, but what can we force them to do in fear of it?
Yeah, this became a major issue between the Tozama, the outer Han, and the Bakufu, because the Bakufu agreed to pay it, and I think Choshu said, "Man, go stuff it." Kagoshima and Choshu said, "We're not paying that," so they ended up paying it. Of course, it made them look weak, and it weakened the treasury. On top of that, you said something very interesting. It was paid in Mexican silver dollars, which a lot of people don't realize. That was the common
Yes.
currency of East Asia at the time,
Pretty amazing.
which came to Mexico via the French.
Okay, a future talk, I'm sure, Lance. All right. Okay, we've only got 3 questions left. So Michael Plasto is asking, were the legations tightly run from the top, or did the secondary staff have very considerable independence? Where would you say they sat on the functionary independent actor axis?
I mean, uh, it would sort of depend on who was in charge. I think some chiefs gave more independence than others. But as an aside, just because of the time delay in communications and transport, or like anyone from a consular official to the chief diplomat had a lot of independence considerably. Um, there are stories of sort of people doing things they shouldn't be and only getting in trouble like a year or two later, sort of thing, because of just the sheer time delay. But I would say overall, like if you had to put it on an axis, it would largely depend on who your chief was, on how much independence you were. But as a standard, it was quite independent overall.
Can I just say, I mean, sorry, but if
No, no.
if they're a consul, and particularly if they were quite far from the capital, then they had an awful lot of,
Yeah.
they could do what they wanted. But if they were actually first secretary, second secretary, something like that, they were working in the legation with the minister,
Mm.
and so therefore they didn't have they couldn't go off.
Yes. Yeah, this is like Paget. Paget complained, despite only having the rank of second secretary, he was unofficially recognized as a first secretary and was doing all the work, but he was like, I'm not getting the wages of a first secretary. I'm not being able to have time off like some of my other former colleagues, like I used to, sort of thing.
But of course, if you were in the diplomatic service, you were supposed to not be working for money.
Mm,
And so the pay was generally lower than the consular service because in the consular service they were professional men.
yes,
They needed, they were
yes.
the money.
It's sort of it's
You had to have a minimum income to
yeah.
get into the diplomatic service in the first place.
Yeah, Paget was richer than most people. I think probably richer than most people went to Japan. I mean, before he went to Japan in America, whilst he was in America, he inherited £30,000 from an Italian family friend, as well as some Italian estates. Um, they were, yeah, despite him complaining about wages, which he didn't, to be honest, it was only early on in his career that he complained. He had plenty of money compared to his compatriots.
Okay, okay. Here's two quick questions to wrap this up from Paul Snowden. I wonder if Paget had any dealings with Lafcadio O'Hearn, who was in Japan 1890 to 1904.
Possibly, probably. I'd have to double check.
Okay,
I mean, Hearn's written a lot, so the likelihood that Paget is mentioned is up there.
okay.
Um,
So that's a big maybe.
yeah, big maybe.
Probably. Okay, fair enough. And then Robert Morton asks, can we not say that the charge D? Is that right?
He finishes the question later on.
Chargé d'affaires.
I pushed
Down.
Oh, pardon me, pardon me.
before I finished writing it.
Too vigorously.
Pardon me.
I was too enthusiastic.
Okay, go
I
ahead.
realized I'd missed off the S, chargé.
Can we not say that the charge d'affaires were placeholders in the respect that they couldn't take policy initiatives? They were important because of how they handled events.
Uh, Possibly. I'm one of two halves in that the more because I've sort of done research into some of the other ones, or starting to. I'm sort of like some of them do fit that bill more in terms of I'm not gonna rock the boat, but I'm gonna handle everything as sort of expected or as things arise. But there are others who definitely I mean I would say Winchester was one who sort of initiate policy changes more or reject policy changes, if that makes sense. But I can see the argument for both, in honesty.
They had to be terribly careful because, of course, the minister was generally in London at the time
Mm,
and was regularly meeting with the Foreign Office.
mm,
So, the minister had their ear
yeah.
while they were on leave, and so if so there's tension between Parks and Watson. You mentioned
Mm,
it over the sighting of the embassy. So Parks was furious. Anything, whenever Watson tried to do anything that was what he thought it should have been, he was furious, and so he was able to talk to the Foreign Office and then persuade the Foreign Office that
mm,
so was wrong. So it was very. I think it was very difficult. Very, very. I would be. I would think you'd be hard pressed to come up with a real initiative that wasn't driven by events. By,
yeah, okay, yeah, that's yeah. I
but
think it also depends
that's for me.
on
So don't listen to me. I'm just what I'm saying. you know.
I think it also depends on their personal relationship because I think Winchester was able to get away with more because he had a more personal relationship with Parks and history with Parks.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Whereas, yeah, people like Neale and Watson with none whatsoever, and Neale with this supposed history of animosity. Um, so yeah, yeah, I think certainly as I sort of read more into it, and I can find sort of things, there are definitely charge d'affaires who are more. I'm here to sort of initiate their will or carry out their plan, sort of thing. Or on a tight leash, if that's a better way of putting it.
So how many of those chargés are actually holding that temporary position while there is a minister, or are they gapped between assignments of ministers?
I can double check.
That's all. That's key, right? Like if Ambassador Morton leaves and he leaves me in charge, I'm the first secretary. he leaves me in charge. I am the chargé, whether it's for an hour or a year, it doesn't matter. But if he's not coming back, he might say, "Oh no, the my mission from the foreign ministry might be go ahead and do everything you can, Chargé Gatling, but they just don't want to promote me. They don't want to pay me, or I've got the wrong parentage in London. Who knows? But they're two different things. One of them is Chargé interim, and then the other is Chargé d'affaires, because the new minister or whatever has not shown up yet. So there's a gap, or there's a vacation. It's kind of a different thing.
Oh, that's why it wasn't loading. Largely, I mean, the Foreign Office doesn't like differentiate. They just say like if whoever's absent, if you're going home, then you're in charge. If you're on your way, you're in charge. I mean, that's basically Winchester. All of Winchester's time in charge wasn't because someone was absent, it was because of travel. Um, Alcock was sort of summarily left in frustration and then reassigned, and Winchester had to take the reins because Neale was ill, etc., etc. And then, yeah, there are others. I mean, there's more like Paget, where unexpected deaths and timings, and they're just there for a few months. Um, I think, where's my list? I think most of them did take charge as charge d'affaires and weren't just first secretary for the entire thing. Um, as in, which is to be expected because diplomats have holidays, they have to return to the UK or whatever, or they might be absent for whatever reason. But I think virtually all of them uh, did act as charge d'affaires, except for the ones, the four that didn't go.
That's right. And of course, even a minister had to obey Foreign Office instructions. So formally there could be no distinction between a minister and a chargé. They're both subject to obeying the instructions of the Foreign Secretary.
Well, the chargé is simply the interim head of mission. Okay, so the mission shows up, and whether the mission, Puerto Rico or not Puerto Rico, Costa Rica has an embassy here with like three Costa Ricans and some local staff. Okay, so if the ambassador leaves, they name the next senior Costa Rican to be the chargé. It doesn't change his diplomatic title. There's difference. There's a title vis-a-vis the mission, and then there's a diplomatic titles. Could be a first secretary, second, third secretary, could be military attaché. It doesn't matter. The chargé is you notify the home country Minister of Foreign Affairs that Ambassador Trull is gone, and Chargé Morton is in charge, and they don't get a choice in it. You name the guy, right? So the country fielding the mission names the person and notifies the host government, but doesn't change your pay rank. It's just like everything else in the government. You're going to work at 2 levels above your pay grade, but you're not going to get paid for it. All right, fine, thank you.
Okay, well, I declare myself the chargé d'affaires, and we're going to wrap this up in a couple of minutes. I'll turn off the recording. Would anybody like to make any last minute comments?
Sorry, could I just ask one question that occurs to me now, since you were talking about Lafcadio Hearn and so on? What documents did people use when they traveled in those days? Like now, passports didn't come in, I don't think, until after World War One, as far as I know. I mean, it's just something that came up last year at a Irish Literature Conference here, and somebody was talking about Lafcadio Hearn and maintaining that he treasured his British passport, but I don't think they had passports in those days. And also, Lafcadio Hearn was half Greek and half Irish. I don't know how he represented himself, but what did they use? Did they need identity, or how did they identify themselves when they arrived in a country?
I mean, in regards to diplomats, they would have had their accreditation
From their own country?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
What about people?
Signed by the Queen.
Yeah, and then there's also they would have also had to get internal passports for a little bit for the Japan interior when that happened, where they had to get sort of permission about routes or where they were going for a short period of time.
Issued by who? Oh,
The Japanese government.
oh, the Japanese government. Okay.
If they
So
didn't
like,
need it, if they were a diplomat, they did need it if they were consular.
yes, sorry, that's true. Yeah, if you were a merchant or the consular service, you needed needed a passport, but for the interior, but not if you were a diplomat.
So the Brits and French had passports back in the 19th century, and then
Did
in
they?
the
Okay.
20th century, they became more widely spread. Some sort of travel document was typical. Like in Japan, you had to have an exit visa. You had to have a permission from the government to travel abroad.
If you were Japanese, you mean?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Well, I remember seeing Wordsworth's passport on display at Dove Cottage. But the thing is, within Europe, they didn't bother to check documents. I mean, it was very casual moving around Europe. You know, it was like Schengen before.
But what was Wordsworth's document? I mean, was it issued by the government or?
Yeah, and it had a description of him that could have fitted almost any man at the time.
Okay.
How funny. Okay, well, I'd like to wrap up the recording now, but not before saying our speaker for next month has joined us, as he often does. And that is Daniel Gallimore. I put some notes in the chat. He'll be talking about the Japanese Shakespeare language and context in the translations of Tsubochi Shoyo. So I'm sure that's going to be absolutely fascinating. All right. Well, let's give a big round to Dr. Michael Trull for this. I feel so bureaucratically enlightened. All right. Thanks, everybody.